Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, my preferred pronouns are she, her, and I would prefer verbal POIs, please. Okay. Throughout the course of time, we think that the point of society is to progress, is to keep on evolving and growing, and we think that the rise of neural network systems is simply a way to help society flourish. It is on this basis that I am so proud to propose today. Before I get into my 2 points of substantive, just a little bit of setup about what this debate actually looks like. We think that in terms of the neural network systems, we think that these are softwares that recognize like formulas, patterns, relationships. They are often modeled after the same way that the human brain thinks. The goal is to mimic human thinking, but with an improved and a self-correcting loop, right? We tell you that when the motion state that is welcome the rise, this means that we don't have to defend it perfect in its current state, right? That is to say that we welcome the fact that it is currently in development and that it will improve in the future, right? We tell you that the rise, what the rise looks like in current society looks like more investments into neural networking systems. It looks like rapid development. It looks like it also being integrated into our daily lives, right? It's currently used for things like games. It's also currently used for things like predicting how customers will act, performing for example, like performing some of the same functions that humans do. We tell you that the yardstick in today's debate is which side is best able to improve society as a whole, right? Okay, so now that's out of the way. Firstly, on my first point of substantive about how it's better able to get rid of cognitive biases in society, right? We tell you that like neural network systems work as similarly to a brain as possible, except the fact that we are able to get rid of some of the biases that are currently entrenched in society. Why is this the case? To do this, let's look at where biases come from in the first place, right? Number one, we tell you that when humans make decisions or when humans have judgment, we tell you that every judgment is a unique individual with a unique upbringing. So they view circumstances differently, right? We tell you that like oftentimes these are things like their worldviews, these are their experiences and the types of things that they've accumulated across the course of their life. This looks like things like political or moral compasses, right? Different experiences or the communities you were brought up in, the teachings that were entrenched in your mind from a young age. Secondly, we tell you that humans are often vulnerable to human emotions, right? So for example, there's human stress that affects cognitive ability. For example, if there were a life-changing circumstance or difficult relationships, oftentimes these also affect human biases. Thirdly, there's also structural influences in our society, right? So for example, there are socioeconomic reasons. We tell you that infrastructure in place in society right now is extremely vulnerable to biases. We tell you that oftentimes these infrastructure that we have in society right now is often constructed based off inherent biases in the past, right? We tell you that neural networking allows society to better move past this, but more on this later in my speech, right? We tell you that, for example, instances such as the criminal justice system, where you determine the fate of somebody's lives, we tell you that it's important above all to make sure you don't put this at risk because of somebody's previous experiences, right? We tell you that ultimately what we get on our side is a system where things are a lot more fair, like where the justice system doesn't contain inherent biases against minorities and it's extremely objective, right? Tell you that like oftentimes what this looks like in the CJS is when judges have like subconsciously internalized things like, oh, Black men are more likely to commit crimes, right? We tell you that as a result of these inherent biases in society, it often leads to a vicious cycle that continuously feeds off internalized notions, right? Why then do we manage to solve this when we welcome the rise of neural networking systems? We tell you that often these biases are unlikely to happen with neural networking for three main reasons, right? Firstly, these systems are not subject to internalize racism because they do not see the world in the same way that humans do, right? For example, if a judge visually saw a person of color entering the courtroom, they may already cognitively lean towards giving a guilty verdict or giving a longer sentence because of their previous experiences, because of all the reasons that I mentioned beforehand, right? We tell you that a neural network takes in all the information that has been all the information at one point in time and considers objective facts, right? Secondly, they're not subject to agendas, right? People don't only make logical decisions off the information they have, but off like what agendas they would want to push, right? Note that this is so much harder to recognize and eliminate because it's much easier for people and for humans to consciously hide within their subconscious, right? This looks like, for example, somebody who's right wing being much more likely to maintain that a Black person is guilty because they may not want to concede that there are flaws in the criminal justice system. Neural networks often like don't have any affiliation with any demographic without any political party, right? And lastly, thirdly, even if we tell you, like as I mentioned, even if we tell you that society has been biased in the past, we tell you that like even if flaws do accumulate within neural networks over time, they do self-correct. There is a constant loop of self-correcting and helping these systems achieve the socially optimal result, right? We tell you that they self-correct much more efficiently and rapidly than humans do, because oftentimes there is a constant feedback loop where these neural network systems are able to learn from their results, able to learn from different patterns and correct the past faults of society, right? They're able to have instant change with socially optimal results. We tell you that as opposed to having humans are much more vulnerable to becoming defensive with their decisions, like when faced with cold evidence, right? We tell you that neural networks will be able to incorporate the fact that they have made mistakes with prior decisions into their new cognitive process. Okay, on to my second point of substantive about why this also helps growth economically, helps society in terms of like businesses and enterprises, right? We tell you that's important to characterize the importance and potential of this new technology in enterprises. We tell you that especially when it comes to like small businesses, like we tell you that it's extremely important for them to rapidly expand using new reliable technology, right? Because small businesses are extremely vulnerable, and at this point in time, it's extremely crucial for every single decision to be the right one, because they cannot afford to mess up, right? If they're unable to succeed, oftentimes it means that it's the end of the small business, right? Therefore, we think that these businesses cannot afford human error, and we tell you that these neural network systems are able to help them thrive, able to help them succeed in society, right? Oftentimes they're a lot more accurate, so they're unlikely to make mistakes when analyzing different options. They're also a lot more efficient, which means that it takes them less time than the average human would need, right? They're able to quickly recognize these patterns and they're able to evolve. We also think that it's not, as a preemptive response, we also think that it's able to improve in terms of job growth, right? Oftentimes, right, companies have to use machine learning to have to train these workers in order to use softwares, right? We think that it's going to create new jobs in terms of analyzing big data, in terms of like mining information, in terms of like managing a lot of different types of data, right? Especially because there is a trend of like changing economies, right? We tell you that on a net and on a global scale, right? This does lead to the creation of new jobs. We tell you that humans will still be necessary in a number of areas. This is simply regarding the progression of society and how society is evolving in terms of technology, right? My deputy is going to be talking about why, in terms of the principle, this is necessary for society to progress, and why technological advancements is something that you should not hinder. For all the reasons above, so proud to propose today. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much to the Prime Minister for that speech. Now I'd like to call upon the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Hi, all right. My preferred gender pronouns are she, her. My preferred POI method is if you could just unmute yourself and ask a POI, because I will not be checking the chat very often. So give me a moment to set up my timer. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. What government is choosing to ignore is they're choosing to ignore the fact on how they're going to let this system just run the world by itself. And this means that like there are going to be jobs being replaced by the system. It means that there's going to be a very complex system that is going to be very hard for humanity itself to understand. And we're going to tell you the reasons why it is going to be the downfall of society, and how it's going to be the downfall for human beings living on this planet. So the first rebuttal I have against the opposition is how they talk about how there's this cognitive biasness in this world, and that is why you see a lot of like biasness happening. You see a lot of racism happening. You see a lot of vulnerable human emotions. Therefore, like not having the best outcome or the best decision made. But understand that with these emotions being put out there, this is how the world is even to progress in the first place. We tell you that humans need to realize their mistakes when it comes to like being racist or being sexist. Therefore, we tell you that a computer is unable to fix this problem, because then the computer is just going to make the decision 24/7 for these human beings. Therefore, these human beings aren't even going to be able to like change their actions, because we tell you that we want this world to be obviously human dominated. But when you welcome the rise of this neural network system, it is obviously more likely going to be taken over by these robots or these AI systems in the future. And that is not what we want. We want these humans to be able to think for themselves. We want these humans to make decisions for themselves, therefore making them more fulfilled with their decision in making these things. Therefore, we tell you that if they make a mistake, they can learn from the mistakes fully and wholeheartedly. Second, what government is trying to tell you is how they're able to thrive in terms of like these small businesses, whereas going to be less likely having mistakes and these kind of things. Right? We tell you that, again, the same thing where humans are able to learn from the mistakes, and these are the things that obviously is the process of life, right? Where you have to learn from your mistakes. It doesn't mean that like you give up like your whole like you give up your whole emotion, or you give up your whole like ability to even choose for yourself to this computer that is based on a probability where they're like, oh, where they think that like, oh, this is the right decision, so I'm going to give it to my human being. No, this is not what we want. We don't want a world where it's being run by solely on system, where like these people are going to lose their jobs, or these people are going to have less jobs in the future because it's going to be taken over by these AI systems, and how these people are not going to be able to make a decision for themselves. A stance that's coming up from governments, from opposition side, is we believe that with the rise of this neural network system, there's going to be little to no benefit to society, but in fact, it's going to harm society even more. Our burden is to prove how like already normal people can't like understand the system or this neural network system because of how complex it is. And we give you an example of how the greatest player of the Go game is already unable to beat this AlphaGo and AlphaZero system that is being created by these brilliant people, right? And by the developers of this neural network system. The stakeholders here is obviously humanity, but most importantly, we're prioritizing these like underprivileged people, or more importantly, these like people that just can't understand the system, or just like, yeah, just underprivileged people, right? So the end goal for our side is we want this world to be like human dominated instead of being dominated by these robots that help you make a decision and help you think for your own self, when we tell you that we much rather prefer humans to be able to make a decision for themselves, right? So a few characterizations, right? The neural network system is a very complex system, or a much rather too complex system for literally anybody else to understand. And basically, like if a malfunction happens in the system, it is going to be very hard in the first place for government to prove on how they're going to fix the system if literally like nobody else is able to understand the system because of how complex it is. Second, with the rise of the neural network system is when more and more computer and more technology is being implemented into these systems, like e.g. the robot AlphaGo or AlphaZero, where like literally they're like when the best player of the game goes unable to beat the system, therefore leading us to believe that literally it's not going to benefit society, because like a very simple or a very simplistic idea to understand this panel is that if other players or other normal players that play this game go, if they cannot beat the game, then what is even the point of playing the game, right? So the first point coming out from opposition side is the big factor of how it takes away jobs in the future. Now, why do we believe that this is true? Because when we tell you that the neural network system is going to be taking up a lot of these jobs that are like mainly human dominated, but because of this system and how like people are going to invest into this system, or how big corporations are going to invest into this like neural network system, it obviously takes away these like large amount of jobs that are being like dominated by humans in the first place, right? Because we tell you that underprivileged people or just normal people that have these certain jobs are unable to like earn money for themselves in the future, because they're going to be like just robot dominated, and it's not going to benefit the majority of society. Because when we tell you that we welcome the rise of it, it means that like in the future there's going to be more and more of these robots roaming the city, or more of these robots that are going to be like taking on your jobs. And this obviously just is a disadvantage as a whole to society, when like you see like society being like, oh, I can't be a lawyer because like this robot has taken my place, or oh, like I can't like be this certain clerk working at this like office job because like I am unable to, because a robot is like doing a better job than me. So obviously this continues the cycle of like humanity, because like everybody is just not going to have a job, they're not going to have a sustainable life, they're obviously not going to be happy in this life because of how the AI is taking over system. The only people that are going to benefit from this system is obviously these like privileged people or these rich people that are able to buy this system and benefit for themselves, right? So what is the conclusion that is coming out from our side of the house? We tell you that with the rise of neural network system, the point on where this system is going to like be implemented like more in the future, and how it's going to be discovered as a system that is going to be like really complex or too complex for literally anybody else to understand in our world. We tell you that that is wrong because of how it's going to hinder jobs, and how my prime minister is going to talk about how it's going to be like mainly robots dominated or AI dominated in the future, and we're going to explain to you why this is bad. With that being said, I've never been prouder to oppose.
All right, thank you so much to the Leader of Opposition for that speech. Now I'd like to call upon Deputy Prime Minister. We're here.
Okay, my time starts in 3, 2, 1. So far in the debate, we've already seen what opposition, where they want to go with their case. They want to convince you that when we develop new technology, we will immediately place it in charge of our governments, of our economy, and allow it to dictate our lives. Does this really seem realistic, right? When Siri was invented, you had people like fear-mongering that Siri would dictate how you live your life, dictating that, saying that Siri would somehow like make all your decisions for you, when in actuality, Siri is an assistant, right? It's an assistant and that serves to benefit humans. We think that at the end of the day, they've not only been unable to prove that we would actually like place such a massive emphasis on neural networking to the point where we get this dystopian society, but they've also been unable to prove any sort of harm that comes from this, right? Like throughout their entire speech, they've been unable to illustrate even a single harm of having this technology that obviously streamlines decision-making processes, that obviously improves people's lives, that subjects people to fairer treatment, that allows businesses to grow far faster, right? Note that the only thing that they told you about how this technology might not be accessible to everyone was that only rich people will be able to buy it. But look, even if we accept that, even if we say that like only a few rich companies will be able to buy this, that means that these machines will be able to track these economic trends, meaning they will be able to set lower prices at the right times. They will be able to make products that are cheaper, that are able to like target specifically what people want to buy. This benefits everyone, obviously. And in the long, and note that currently this technology is still like in development, right? That's not to say this technology is currently in development. That is to say that we think that both sides have the fiat to assume that this technology will improve over time before it is finally implemented. We think that it's completely unfair for opposition to come up here and saying you're going to throw technology that's still in its alpha stage and allow it to run at the entire country. Okay, before I move on to my point, just some basic rebuttals. We think that opposition has already started with an obvious straw man when they tell you that we would let it run the world. We would like to refer to the motion, right? The motion is we welcome the rise of this technology. This clearly shows that this is a new phenomenon. This is not something that already has working plans. This is not something that we already have working plans to place in such a high position. We think it's also such a strange stance to take because they never give you any reasoning. Anytime there are technological advancements, people will be cautious about it. People will take the necessary precautions, especially people who are unsure about this technology, right? We think that people are not stupid to such an extent that they would place it above all else. But secondly, the only impact they're able to throw at you under this notion is that some people will lose their jobs. Note, this also happens anytime there's any form of technological advancement. If we follow their logic and see where it takes us to this weird stone age where people built their own stone homes rather than relying on scary machinery, because they think when people use cranes, then they're becoming complacent and they don't want to lift stones by themselves. This is how ridiculous their logic sounds, right? Thirdly, on the idea of underprivileged people, frankly, we think it's just discriminatory for Op to say that poor people can't understand technology, that they'll never be able to understand technology. We think that oftentimes these poor people or people who might be overlooked within society are exactly the people who are able to rise up to this level, are the people who are able to rise up to fill in these positions, things like fixing this machinery, things like looking at the patterns, the outputs that this machinery gives you, because of the fact that there are now new jobs being created. When new jobs are created, new people will go in to fill these roles. We think that is exactly why we benefit underprivileged people. And thirdly, this idea of they want the world to be human dominated, then surely that means that their stance is that they want to oppose any forms of automation at all. This is an incredibly generic argument. Like when the camera was invented in the 1800s, most people didn't know how to use it. But as time goes on, and as we have to assume, as technology becomes integrated into society, as more and more people learn how to use it, it becomes normalized. It's just how society grows after all. And we question whether they would rather have society stagnate. We tell you that on our side of the house, in terms of underprivileged people, we're able to give them better job selections, we're able to get rid of biases, and they obviously stand to benefit because of the fact that they're now no longer being judged for being poor because they're stupid or lazy, right? Moving on to my argument about how this is a gateway to improving all forms of artificial intelligence. Note that this stands separately and on its own, meaning that even if this point alone stands by the end of the debate, even if we're only able to prove that neural networking is like a quality of life improvement to technology that we already have, then we all still win the debate. 3 levels of analysis for this. Firstly, neural networking is not a substituted form of AI. Rather, it's an additive improvement to technologies that we already have, to technologies that we are already investing into. Like here's some proof for this, right? The concept of computers that can think for themselves is not new, but the concept of computers, of neural networks that can entirely develop new ways of thinking on the fly is frankly groundbreaking. All too often, technology that we already have still falls back on patterns and outcomes. We think that oftentimes it's not progressive enough. This means, what this means for AI is that in our world, we tell you that many firms many firms already use AI to detect trends, but because these AIs eventually fall back on the basic idea of like input output, we think neural networking is able to circumvent this problem. It means that these machines are going to be able to evolve on the fly and are going to be able to make the best decisions that benefit people, that create the most amount of jobs, that create the most amount of net utility. Secondly, we think that AI has always served to assist humans. That is to say that in the technology sector, there are very fundamental tenets that any sort of technology you create must have a practical benefit for humans. For example, you have literal laws and automation that a robot cannot ever harm a human. We think that this alone already like invalidates a lot of what opposition says, because this technology does already come under very strict strict regulations as to what is able what it is able to like what boundaries it is not allowed to cross, right? We think that under this, we think the average person would stand to benefit from neural networking, not be harmed by it. For example, the average job would pay higher salaries because firms would be able to make smarter decisions, therefore gain more revenue, therefore pay more. This is pretty intuitive, right? We think the average person also stands to benefit just because of how we already use AI in our everyday life, right? Like in a world where people already use devices for almost everything, when neural networking is able to be incorporated into these devices, our life becomes better and our life becomes slightly better, but in every conceivable aspect, meaning that even if it's only a very small benefit, the fact that it affects the fact that it's given to everyone and the fact that it improves every aspect of our lives is something that we ought to celebrate. Thirdly, all potential benefits and harms aside, we think that massive technological advancements such as neural networking ought to be welcomed and they ought to be celebrated simply because of the fact that they demonstrate incredible progressions in our society, right? We think that the fact that we're able to replicate the human thought process without subjective biases, without things like pushing political agendas, is something that we ought to celebrate. Is something that we ought to celebrate on the grounds that it shows how far our science has come. It shows that like humanity has improved and society has improved to such an extent that we're able to strive towards a better world. We think in a world where you fearmonger and you want to cling onto the past is not a world that we're willing to stand for. We want to march boldly into the future. For this, we urge you to vote for side government. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much to Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. Now I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, thank you so much. My preferred method of POIs are verbally unmuting yourself, or you can offer the POIs in the chat. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I am unclear as to what the extent of neural network system and the benefits that they provide, so long as state government gives us 2 very simple and low burdens as to what these neural network systems looks like. First, they tell us that they're able to evolve on the fly and they're able to mimic human thinking. Yet secondly, they tell us that these neural network systems are able to look at past trends and analyze them, which isn't much different from the algorithm systems that we see today, right? But secondly, all of the applications that they told us are necessarily flawed in the sense where all of the applications that they mentioned, which is the criminal justice system, targeted advertising, building businesses, not only did they lack the necessary link to prove why the implement of these systems necessarily means that abuse is lowered, but secondly, why you necessarily need neural network systems in the current situation where even they admit that the neural network system isn't perfect, right? all of the responses and rebuttals will be integrated into my argument. I'm going to talk about the 3 applications of neural network systems, 2 that came up in the government bench, and the last on military abuse. First, they talked about criminal justice system. We can look at this in 4 ways, right? First, the concession that the current system is not perfect, and therefore you either A, are going to not implement this immediately, which means their benefits are long-term anyway, or second, they implement it as soon as possible, which means you willingly subject individuals' fate to an imperfect system. Second, I'm going to tell you why there is a contradiction in the characterization of how the neural network system mimics the human brain. First, they tell us that if it's true that they're able to mimic human thinking, then one of 2 things can happen, right? A, either they also mimic the human biases, which mitigates their benefit, or second, they're unable to fully replicate human thinking, which also comes at a trade-off of trading off empathy and sympathy, which is necessary in making decisions. That is why we have the choice of choosing juries, right? Because different criminal cases have different circumstances that cannot be fully reliant on an AI that heavily relies on
POI.
algorithms, right? No, thank you. For example, we would say it would be an objective decision from the AI standpoint to send a person that stole with like pretty clear evidence, for example. But the human connection or the human correction is there's a human correction in the ability to understand the person's necessity when committing these petty crimes, right? We think, therefore, you always need a human correction in the criminal justice system, even if the neural network system is seen as more objective. We don't necessarily see why being more objective is necessarily better. Third, why you reduce accountability? Because if it's true that you analyze trends, then any sort of fault in the judiciary system can easily be scapegoated to the simple reason of, oh, the system isn't perfect. We think in the instance where there is human error, individuals like individual juries or individual judges are able to take accountability. So in the instance, for example, if there is a constant trend of people of color being incarcerated, we think it is likely also that the neural network system that they propose is also going to make a quote unquote objective decision based on the probability of trend. But fourth, why we on their response on biases, right? We admit that currently there are biases, but we think society is striving towards having more mitigatory factors, right? For example, there's a rise on people of color voicing out. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement, or also necessarily like a lot of functioning democracies means that the citizens are able to place pressures on their local representatives to take action when abuse is happening. We think side government lacks that when they automate the system in a sense where they place all of the responsibility towards the NNS. Before I continue, I'll take a POI.
Okay, on the idea that neural networking will adopt biases, on your side, humans will still be defensive. They will still have this entrenched idea that makes it a lot more difficult to change. At least with a neural network, if it adopts biases, you can clearly see that, and it won't try to like stop you when it realizes that it's made a mistake. What is your response to that?
Yeah, so if there's a judge with a history of being racist, then we can use democracy and place pressure on our local senators or local representatives to kick that person out. We aren't able to do that with the neural network system because one, there isn't any alternative of any AI. But second, individuals can say that, oh, we've corrected the mechanism. Well, we don't actually know whether the software has been changed, right? Or whether the software has actually been improved. Since given the analysis that you said that is always self-correcting, we don't necessarily know what the metric should be as to deciding whether the neural network system have been improved or not. Second, regarding targeted advertising, right? They say it improves job growth and say that business making more money necessarily means that the workers also get the increase in wages. First, we don't see why that's true. Obviously, you see Jeff Bezos earning money like tripling or like doubling his net worth since the pandemic started, but yet Amazon workers are succumbed to horrible living conditions. We don't see the link between increasing profit and the workers necessarily benefiting. But again, we think that if it's true that the benefit of helping businesses is solely based on the fact that it acts as an algorithm, we don't necessarily see why you have to have the neural network system. Lastly, on the application of military, I think the fact that AI thinks outside the box and is able to outsmart individuals is extremely attractive to military officials. We think if you let this network increasingly being funded and increasingly improving itself, the result or the outcome are warfare being much more malicious. The fact that if you can compute the end goal of this NNS in military to be to have a higher chance of winning the war, we think the strategies that necessarily are implemented are going to lead to more collateral damage or necessarily trading off the significant amount of lives in the instance where the objective goal is winning the war. At the end of the day, NNS cannot replicate human emotion. That is why we oppose.
Right, thank you so much to the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. Now I'd like to call upon the government whip here.
Okay, just before I begin my speech, I would like verbal POIs, please. After two whole speeches from the opposition, we still don't understand what their counterfactual is, right? What do they actually prefer, right? So far, they haven't actually given any sort of alternative to what exactly their world actually looks like, and they pushed so much on how society is going to become entirely AI dominated, right? They tell you that you're going to lose so many jobs because you have these neural network systems, right? We think that this argument again is against technology as a whole. In any world where new technology is introduced, jobs will be lost, right? So we asked the opposition what they actually prefer, living in the Stone Age and reverting back to a time where technology doesn't exist, right? It's extremely unclear what the opposition actually wants, right? Okay, so they tell you that their end goal is that they want to be able to have a human-dominated society. They prefer humans to be able to make their own decisions. We think that we would like to remind them that we don't think that we're creating a robotic society where humans are incapable of making their own decisions, right? More on this later in my speech. Okay. So two things that we heard from opposition, right? Firstly, what they told you that you're going to let the system take over and replace the jobs in society, right? They tell you that humans are not going to be able to learn from their mistakes and to be able to fix them in the future, right? We think that there's certain we think that there's two responses to this. Firstly, we think there's certain things that you cannot afford to sacrifice for humans to grow and learn, right? We think that you don't. So firstly, we think that we don't think that these biases that we talked about in our prime minister are mistakes, right? We think there's fundamentally the views of people in themselves. And there are specifically, we told you in our prime minister that we think these biases are specifically focused on things such as racism, things like classism, right? These are active decisions that people make based off of their own experiences and their own opinions, right? Making these mistakes over and over again. Eventually, we just don't think that these are mistakes anymore. They're not doing this unintentionally, right? We think that these biases look like, for example, choosing people for jobs due to connections rather than choosing people who are actually qualified for these jobs, right? We think these aren't just mistakes. These are the inherent natures of those at the top, those who are the most the rich of the rich, right? We think these are not the mistakes that they tell you are going to happen on opposition side, right? Second response, we think it's absolutely disgusting for them to be able to use people's lives as a learning experience, right? Two examples of what this actually looks like. For example, if you look at the criminal justice system, right? When this is inherently a racist system and it's determined to carry out things such as mass incarcerations, where it's so biased to against Black people, right? Just look at the proportion of Black people people that are unfairly incarcerated, right? And the opposition cannot come here and tell you that because they want people to learn from their mistakes, that this means that they should allow biased judges to be able to determine whether or not a man will go to prison, right? We think this is so disgusting for them to do so, right? You cannot use people's lives as a whole experiment for you to be able to learn from your own mistakes, right? There are certain things that are just too risky to be able to allow human error to be able to determine, and that they have too much of a stake for human error to occur, right? Okay, and
Point.
secondly, we also think that like with small businesses, this is another example of where we think that error cannot be afforded, right? Especially because we think that during this time, they're at a crucial point in their development. We think that these small businesses need to be able to succeed. We think in order to do so, they cannot afford human error because otherwise they're automatically going, we think that they're very likely to be able to fail, right? And that these neural network systems, because of the fact that they are so efficient, because of the fact that they are so reliable and much more faster, that they're going to be so much better for the development of these small businesses. And note that we've told you that these neural network systems themselves are meant to be neutral, right? I mean that even if they aren't, as opposition tries to tell you, they're constantly learning from what they do. I mean that they're looking for they're looking at history and changing their methods, correcting their mistakes based off of objective data that they take from information, right? And that this is a mesh between looking at a bunch of data and like also at the same time like human thinking, because it like mimics the brain, right? But then you still on government side, you still get socially optimal outcomes, right? And that also this debate is about the rise of these neural network systems, right? And that these flaws can be corrected as they become more and more integrated, right? So we think that this doesn't like this could be about like anything, right? This doesn't have to be, just be limited to things like racism, right? That this is like we think that like that like okay, so we think that these sort of like biases like include things like attractiveness, right? Like what you actually look like. Judges are less likely to sentence people who are like attractive women, right? Neural networking systems do not have this because they don't make these decisions based off of the appearances of people, right? So we think that like if anything, these neural network systems are able to give people a way to grow and challenge themselves, as opposition seems to like so want people to be able to learn from their mistakes, right? The example they give you in Leader of Opposition of the Chinese game Go, right? We know that this neural network system was a way to be able to challenge people that otherwise wouldn't have as much of a challenge put towards them, right? Being able to defeat the best player in the world, that was already a huge accomplishment. We allow people to learn and grow further, right? People can use these neural network systems to be able to learn, to be able to adapt and benefit themselves without being subject to biases, right? And that you give a lot of practical benefits to these humans. We don't understand why this only happens on opposition side, right? And the second thing that they give you is that they tell you that it's going to be too complex for these neural network systems are too complex for humans to understand. We just don't understand why this actually matters at the end of the day, because we think this is like an inherent problem with technology itself, right? What does opposition actually want? Do they not want to be able to introduce like any sort of technology at any point in time, right? If you look at different examples of when technology was actually integrated into society, for example, if you look at phones, at the beginning, like no one knew how to use them, right? As you see in the status quo, almost we think they're like basically everywhere. They were managed to be able to integrate into society, no matter how complex they seem to be at the time, right? We see that as generations develop, we tell you that they adapt, like these generations adapt to become more and more technologically advanced. This isn't actually a problem, right? But even if it was a problem, we know that it's an argument against like technology itself. We don't understand why it stands. We ask the opposition if they have a problem with the concept of like advancing technology itself. We don't think that this is actually like a specific harm that's unique to like neural network systems, right? Okay, and we also think that like when they tell you that it's too complex for humans to be able to understand, we think this is also extremely discriminatory towards but because they're essentially saying that like these poor people aren't going to be able to understand technology, and that they're extremely capable of doing so, right? We think this is the exact rhetoric that is used against poor people and helping them to be able to progress, right? We think it's so important for them to be able to. We think that it's so important for these neural network systems to be able to be integrated into society, and therefore we take this debate. Thank you.
Right, thank you to the government whip for that speech. Now I'd like to call upon the opposition whip. Here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, my name is Arshini. I'll be the opposition whip. My preferred gender pronouns are she, her, and my preferred method of POIs is just unmuting and verbally telling me, because I don't think I'll be checking the chat. Let me just get my timer. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, we on opposition side believe that government side has fundamentally not understood what we are trying to explain throughout this entire debate and are constantly focusing on their side of the debate, which is in and of itself contradictory. So here's how my speech is going to go. First, I'm going to state a few general rebuttals that don't fit in with the rest of my substantive. Then I will be going to the main clash of this debate and why I believe that side opposition has won that clash. So first of all, for general rebuttals, my first issue with government speeches is that they tend to have contradictions in and of itself. The reason why it's contradictory is because the first speaker and the third speaker talked about how the neural networking system gets rid of cognitive biases. And for example, the first speaker and third speaker both use examples of courtrooms and things like that, and how it helps avoid racist judges from persecuting people of color. And they also talked about how it's able to help economically and things like that, both of which are quite important aspects of our lives and society in general. However, the second speaker also talked about how there won't actually be such a big emphasis of the neural networking system in society, and also that it won't necessarily kind of take over the world. It's hard for us to understand how the system can avoid the system from becoming too influential on the planet when they also encourage the implementation of it in such important parts of society. So with that contradiction in and of itself, it's hard for us to understand what exactly government wants. And yeah, so yeah, there was no clarification about that. Another thing is that government also stated that people will be cautious, which came out in the second speaker's speech. They talked about how people are going to be cautious, and that's why there won't be they won't necessarily kind of take over the world, right? However, I understand that for a lot of people, such especially companies that prioritize profit, or for example, dictatorships of governments that want to silence its people and control its people, these type of influential forces will not these type of international forces will not be cautious or will not necessarily take into consideration the best interest of society in general, as they have other things that motivate them, such as profit, and silencing people, which can be helped by the neural network system. So this idea that it's going to somehow avoid reaching a point where it is so influential that it takes over the world, just because people will be cautious, is idealistic and unrealistic in and of itself. They also constantly made comparisons with our world and what we were trying to say, by saying that we wanted to revert to the Stone Age and things like that, by trying to frame it as if that we don't want any more new technology in the world. Yes, because that isn't what we're trying to say. We still are okay with the progression of technology and things like that. However, not to a point where that technology literally replicates the human brain and is able to make decisions for humans and things like that, right? It's also considering the fact that it is a system that is so incredibly powerful and influential, to compare it to things like cranes, which are controlled by human beings, or cameras or things like that, is irrelevant, and it's completely an extreme characterization, right? So let's go to the main clash of today's debate. So I think that what both sides, what government side wanted to prove was that the benefit outweighs harms, whereas opposition side wanted to prove that the harms outweigh the benefits. So here's what I'm going to tell you. That opposition is right in this scenario. So in opposition, we tell you that the harms are that this thing in and of itself takes away jobs, while Prime Minister did say that as a preemptive response that there are other jobs such as mining data and etc. that are created with the existence of the neural network system and with the development of it. They also stated that while other jobs in small businesses, that especially for small businesses, can use the neural network system to kind of control the business and be used for them, right? So first of all, even if small businesses could afford neural networking systems, which we find extremely unlikely, considering the fact that it is such a powerful technology that small businesses all around the world are going to be able to afford it, we find that very, very unlikely. So even if they could afford it in their best case scenario, we think that it still causes underprivileged people to suffer, because jobs in, for example, grocery stores or things like that, which are now being taken over by the neural networking system, are jobs that underprivileged people who couldn't afford to, complete their higher education, people who couldn't afford to maybe get like extra education to get better results and things like that. For those people, those are the type of jobs that they need in order to survive. However, those jobs are not being taken over by the neural networking system. Whereas for jobs, for example, like mining data, like being a developer of the neural networking system, things like that, those things require, for example, degrees in computer science. They require a lot of extensive knowledge, and those are things that underprivileged people do not have, just because they're in a position where they are unable to obtain those degrees or those qualifications that privileged people can. So that is kind of what we meant when we said that poor people kind of don't understand this thing, it's because that they don't have the ability to get that knowledge through degrees in university, through lessons and things like that, which are all things that are attainable for richer people to get, right? So that's what kind of we meant. So them implying that we're saying it's discriminatory is wrong, because we're not saying that poor people are too dumb or whatever to understand it. That's not what we're saying at all. We're just saying that they don't have the privilege to be able to understand it in the first place, because they're not in a situation or a learning environment that gives them the ability to obtain this knowledge, right? So what are the benefits that were presented by the government, right? So they talked about how essentially this neural networking system gets rid of cognitive biases. First of all, I think that the fact that they get rid of cognitive biases could be used wrongly and could be exploited due to the fact that it does not feel vulnerabilities or emotion and things like that. If we're talking about a more extreme level, it could be used in warfare and those type of things. So we think that the existence of the absence of cognitive biases in NNS is already it could already be used in a very bad way. So when the first and third speaker talked about cognitive biases and used the examples of courtrooms and things like that and how it helps underprivileged people, we find it detrimental, considering the fact that if ever a bad decision were to be made, or a decision that wasn't fair was to be made, considering the fact that these NNS do not feel emotions, regular people's judgment would be neglected, because people controlling the NNS and things like that, and the people using it, would justify the decisions made by it by saying, oh, it's supposed to be perfect, it's supposed to be free of bias. So in general, the harms of it being worse to underprivileged people by taking away jobs far overrides the unlikely ability of it to get rid of cognitive biases, because it still can be used against them, and that can create more harms in and of itself. So if you want a side that protects the people and protects society in general, but while avoiding more problems from being caused, please vote for a side of opposition. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much to the opposition whip. Now I'd like to call upon the opposition reply. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, thank you so much. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Government side lost because they failed to acknowledge the humans need to be run by other humans with equal human emotions, with equal sympathy when it comes to situations that can have a myriad of external factors, things like the criminal justice system, things like the military, or things like the militia that went unresponded by the way. Next, I want to, from the get-go, take note of the major concession that government gave, which is if it's true that the criminal justice system, businesses, etc., are going to implement this neural network system, then I am unsure as to why it wouldn't be normalized in a sense where society would be dominated by these AIs, by these artificial intelligence, right? But if it's true that artificial intelligence has so many benefits, we also don't see why government wouldn't just bite the bullet and say we are willing to accept that. There is a contradiction right there. But second, let's look at the three things the three clashes of or issues that were discussed in this debate. First, whether you remove biases specifically in the criminal justice system. Second, whether you increase the increase in revenue for business translates to improving the job qualities, etc. And third, again, the military argument that went unresponded from government whip. First, remove biases. I think the neural network systems are going to be more punitive towards criminals because of its objective measures, right? That is why you necessarily need human correction in cases where other external factors needs to be taken into consideration. Things like your financial circumstance, things that your mental capability in that certain scenario. All of these things are factors that can be taken into consideration when you have human emotions. No response given by government. Third, accountability. We think if a government wants to cop out and say they will only implement it when it is perfect or when it is when majority of the software is unproblematic. First, the benefit that they garner is long-term. But second, the only way you can detect errors is if you implement it, right? So they can't just fiat that there will be no errors whatsoever. But lastly, I think it's extremely problematic for the individuals that were sentenced like falsely, or were sentenced like their sentencing gone through an error, but they're unable to appeal because of the lack of accountability through AI software. Because individuals can scapegoat it and say, I know the software is the most punitive, is the most objective, is the most advanced. Therefore, we don't need to reevaluate your court appeal cases. Lastly, we concede that there were biases and note that we're being charitable, we're engaging with them. But we told you that were mitigatory factors. Things like being able to pressure through democracy through your local representatives. Second, the like instigation of court cases appeal means that the the criminal justice system recognizes that human errors are present, but that doesn't necessarily mean you cannot correct like adequately, right? Third, the fact that people are more politically aware, things like social movements on the rise. All of these three mitigatory factors went unresponded. Second, you increase revenue for businesses. Even if we take it at the best case scenario and businesses are able to make better decisions, we are unsure as to why the increase of profit necessarily leads to the increase in wages. We think bosses and CEOs are greedy, are capitalistic. They would just likely pocket themselves. But second, this is neglecting my leader of opposition's argument, right? Where we tell you lessen the job opportunities. Things like integration of the neural network system in marketing means that you lessen or you fire your entire marketing department. And the only jobs created are specialized jobs in technology, whereas government removes general jobs. There's a problem solution mismatch, and government was unwilling to respond. That is why opposition won.
All right, thank you, Op reply. Now I'd like to call upon the Gov reply to end our debate for the day. Thank you.
3, 2, 1. Opposition says that they're unsure a lot. We suspect that it's because they haven't really listened to our case at all. Note that throughout the bench, they've essentially repeated the same two things. Firstly, that neural networking has flaws, and these flaws are problematic because bad things are bad. Secondly, that it will be used in society, in the upper echelons of society, for example, in a dictatorship. This by itself is really strange, because surely the point of a dictatorship is that one person will make all the decisions, not that they'll hand it over to a computer, but not that they'll hand it over to a computer, but I digress, right? Ultimately, this debate boils down to two questions. Firstly, whether neural networking will lead to fewer biases in the long term. Secondly, how this will actually be used in society, whether this has benefits to individuals. Firstly, on biases, right? We told you from our Prime Minister's speech that humans will always be subject to biases. No amount of societal pressure will change that, because it's in our human nature to use our personal experiences and factor that into our thinking. In daily life, like if you're choosing what to eat for lunch, then sure, that's great. But in the case where the cost of human error, the cost of cognitive bias is literally sending an innocent person to jail, this is a cost that we're not willing to incur. It doesn't even have to be racism. It could simply be someone's accent, right? Whether they remind you of someone you know, a defendant being considered attractive, of cognitive errors like confirmation bias, jumping to conclusion, of like accidentally assigning more weight to certain factors, right? We gave you so much analysis on the different ways in which humans fall to these biases, and neural networking is able to avoid them. These neural networking literally doesn't see physical differences. But even if opposition wants to assume that neural networking would eventually become biased, we told you that the whole concept of neural networking is based around self-correcting methods, meaning that even if in our worst case scenario, it adopts a bias, it can recognize when a decision is misguided, when a factor such as skin color is irrelevant, because of the fact that it can take into account how, like, whether this decision was good or not in the long term, right? In a game, you make a move and then you look at the consequences of the move. You don't make these moves in a vacuum, right? This obviously proves that these neural networking systems are more advanced than they give them credit for. We think also, furthermore, to get rid of such a bias in a database is so much more simple than trying to like fundamentally rebuild the criminal justice system from the ground up. We think, for example, in our world, could just be like changing some code so that the network doesn't take certain factors into account, right? Lastly, on biases, they told you in WIP, they give you this last ditch resort as like human biases are good. For example, you can feel sympathy for someone, but they're unable to prove why these few good human biases outweigh the very real and tangible biases of things like, oh, systematic racism, right? We think that at the end of the day, at worst case, there are certain biases and it's unknowable how bad they are. Or like in the best case scenario, we see that they're ultimately unknowable. We see that they're like biases that we cannot possibly stand for unsigned government. Secondly, how will this be used in society? Now, opposition calls us contradictory for arguing that neural networking has applications in some fields and not others. Note that we actually give you very clear fields in which neural networking may be necessary, in which personal biases should not exist. We give you very real things like the criminal justice system, in cases like where corporations are likely to invest in it because they know if they analyze these market trends correctly, it can boost their revenue. It allows them to invest in better technology. It allows them to motivate their workers more, right? They also give this really strange military argument that never really goes anywhere. Only in opposition WIP do they give you the example of a dictator, which is so strange because, as I've stated before, like dictators will probably be the one party that will never give their decisions over to a machine, right? Okay. Lastly, on the harms and benefits to society, this is something that we'll give them credit for. They stuck to their guns on this. It will lead to the loss of jobs. However, we gave you two responses to this. Firstly, we told you in our deputy speaker, and as well as in our whip, that this is a really vague and generic argument that argues against any form of technological advancement. Secondly, we already responded to this. We told you it will create more jobs. At the very worst, it will create an equal amount of jobs that people can fill. At the very best, it will create more jobs and therefore create more economic prosperity. For all these reasons, we take this debate by a landslide. Thank you.
Teams, the results will be announced later on in the main hall. So good luck, and you can leave the breakout room.